Hello and welcome to our latest webinar. Roses are red, violets are blue. Do these colors look right to you? Here, where Kevin and Steve find out why a waveform monitor is your best friend when it comes to virtual production. With the growth and virtual production comes a new series of challenges, and Steve and Kevin are fortunate to be joined today by David Stump, Director of Photography at American Society of Cinematographers. He's got vast experience in this field. So, in the next 45 minutes or so, David, Steve, and Kevin will take you back to the basics when it comes to shooting blue screens, green screens in standard dynamic range, SDR, and why you need a waveform monitor and tools like Leader's Cinezone real-time false color exposure tool. And then we'll get into the challenges that shooting in HDR brings to blue screen, green screen productions. So this will be followed by a look at working with video arrays and how different lighting can have a significant effect on the artistic intent of your production. We'll be taking questions, so use the chat in Zoom as you're doing now to take part in the discussion. All right, handing over to Steve and Kevin.
Cindy, thank you very much. And Steve, happy Mardi Gras.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that.
And David, thank you for joining us. Well, it's Shrove Tuesday in English money. So I believe some people are partying somewhere in the world.
Yes, it's party time somewhere.
So David, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
David, for those who don't know you, would you like to give a brief introduction to yourself?
I am David Stump, ASC, and newly BVK, the German Society. I'm a cinematographer. I do visual effects supervision. I do stereography. I do workflow design. I'm an author and part-time workaholic.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that quick introduction. So, should we start at the beginning, and let's assume that people, they know about shooting green screens and blue screens, but let's take it right the way back to some of the basics and some of the mistakes people make with those, Dave.
Okay. Technically speaking, blue screen and green screen are color difference matting. And there are two parts of the signal, two parts of the technique contributing to pulling mats. One is color and the other is difference. And when I say different, you're trying to create an environment where the background that you're dropping out is as different as possible from the foreground that you're keeping. And so we generally use blue screen and green screen, depending on the subject matter in the foreground. If you were shooting army men in green uniforms to put into a background, you would certainly shoot against blue screen. And there are some things that work very well against blue screens and some things that work very well against green screens. The green signal, as we know, is the luminance channel. And what, as we don't commonly know, is the best focus channel on a monoplanar sensor. So when you use green screen, you get the best and cleanest mats because they most resemble the outline of the foreground subject. Whereas red screen is wildly different, and blue screen, blue record, is mildly different than the foreground. Green screen mats adhere very well. There's a lot to know about lighting for a blue screen or a green screen. In order to create that color difference, you want a pure color out of the screen, and you want as even a color as you can get behind the actors or foreground that you're shooting. And those two factors really contribute to the success of the technique. I think perhaps we could put up some of the shots of the green screen sample that I with the silhouetted actor in the foreground.
Yes, sir. I can put that up. Okay.
So this is from an actual production take, and this was a rehearsal. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to get as even a screen exposure as I could possibly get across the entire screen, because usually you don't know where an actor is going to go once you start a take. They can do a rehearsal, and that's good. And then when the moment strikes them, they can go wildly off your blue screen or green screen. So I generally try to cover everything I think is going to be in their action area. And in this case, it was the full frame. And in this case, there was a little unevenness in the actual fabric of the screen itself. So as nicely as I tried to light it, it's a little uneven, but we'll see. Let's look at some of the other samples, some of the analysis of this.
So one of the things that popped up was doing a false color across it. It was not super even. And then if you look at the waveform shot of this, you can see there was a lot of red and blue bleeding into that shot.
And that's generally because you're lighting the foreground for an action area. And the thing that you try to keep in mind as you're working doing blue screen or green screen is that you're actually lighting two scenes. Scene one is the foreground with the actor, and scene two is the background with the green screen. And what you're seeing there is a work in progress screen as I was lighting it, and I hadn't finished flagging the foreground lights off of the green screen, and those contribute to exposure in red and blue on the screen itself. So this is a good illustration of what goes wrong in doing blue screen and green screen, because the more pure you get that green color without red or green in it, the better a matte you can pull. Now, this is pumped up pretty high, and this is much brighter than I would normally do, normally expose a green screen. And there's something else going on in here as well. As you can see, there's sort of a horseshoe shape to the screen exposure, and it falls off at the sides, and it's brighter in the middle. And in this case, that was because we were using let me say, a lesser quality zoom, which had a lot of portholing in the lens, and we exposed from their LED wall, which is almost certainly guaranteed to be even across the field of view of the camera. And we shot it with a wide angle end of a zoom lens, and you can see there's still some arch in the blue record. Now, if you go to the next frame, which is a longer lens, you can see that it starts to arch off towards the corners. And if you go to the third frame, it arches off even more as we go longer on the lens. This is a phenomenon called portholing, and it is due to a number of factors, all of which are in the optics of the lens. It is mostly due to the refractive index of the glass. So as rays enter the lens, when they enter from the corners of the lens, they have to travel further and through a different magnification of the glass and a different refractive index of the glass than they do at the center. So it's easy to get a flat field at the middle of the lens. It is difficult to get the same flat field exposure at the corners of the lens. And depending on a lot of things, mostly the price of the lens, you can get wildly varying amounts of portholing across the frame. Most lenses are constructed entocentrically, and that means that the rays enter and emanate from an entrance pupil and an exit pupil, and they enter as a frustum and they exit as a frustum. And what that gives you is a different refractive index at these, you can see these red points, these red lines along the edges of the frame, than it gives you at the center of the frame and as you progress towards the edges of the frame. So there's a different refractive index at the corners of the lenses than there is at the center. Now, if you go to the telecentric lens, image space telecentric lens, one of the advantages that we've gained out of new cameras especially that take advantage of the large PL mount or LPL mount and LPL mount designed lenses, is that we have in cameras now eliminated the spinning mirror shutter that we used to use to reflect the lens output to a viewfinder so that we could operate the camera looking through the lens. Now we operate cameras looking at video monitors or video eyepieces. So we don't need the spinning mirror anymore, which enables optical designers to move the lens group closer to the image plane. And what that gives them for technical reasons, it gives them the ability to create a more image space telecentric lens. That is a lens where, in spite of the fact that rays enter as a frustum, they exit as more of a flat plane. And what that means is a number of things. It means that the refractive index is different from entocentric lenses in that it's more even across the image plane. And it also means that the rays striking the image plane are more normal to the image plane. So there is less crosstalk and less reflection inside the lens cavity. And there's less contribution from stray rays. And the rays from the back of the lens strike all of the image plane at a more normal angle, which results in a more even field. So these are improvements in imaging, digital imaging, and digital imaging optics. And that gives you a lot more even field than what we first started off looking at.
Yes,
Any
so
questions
basically
about that?
what you're saying, Dave, when it comes to lenses, is there a reason why some are cheap and some are very expensive?
Oh, yes, there are. And there are also reasons why they've moved the lens flange closer to the sensor and made it bigger. And that's so that the exit pupil of the lens is bigger and it's closer to, it is more compatible with normal rays striking the sensor.
So from what you've shown us on the waveform, you can very simply point your camera at your subject matter and have a look at that waveform and see if you've got that kind of crescent starting to form or not.
Right. And you can generally visibly see it because a very evenly lit gray card that was exposed at gray, and I deliberately exposed this to reveal what kind of portholing you get out of a pretty decent lens. This is an old Zeiss speed prime. And if you go to the waveform shot of that, you can see how much it falls off from center to corner. just as a function of refractive index. So when you're doing blue screen and green screen, you stand a better chance of getting a more even exposure across the entire field with newer lenses and more telecentric lenses. But when I go into a rental shop and I ask them what they have that is more telecentric in their lens cage, I frequently find they look at me like I'm on fire.
I was just going to ask you that. I was going to say that it looked like you were from Mars or something.
Yeah, so I've just had to, educate myself about which lenses I like when I'm shooting blue screen or green screen, and it's really just a question of education.
Yes.
And then you run into things like, like what you're seeing here, where the fabric is a different color at that crease about a third of the way up. And you combine that with the issues of portholing in the lens and the issues of trying to light an even green field on stage while the clock is ticking and the AD is breathing down your neck. And you can see why a lot of times things get messed up when shooting blue screen or green screen.
Yeah.
And you don't generally ever get to, as a cinematographer, you don't ever really get to see the ramifications of a messed up blue screen or green screen because you don't get to follow it through post-production.
Yeah.
But as a visual effects supervisor and a cinematographer, I get to chase the images all the way through to finishing. And I get to see the fruits of my own labor, and I have instant feedback whether I did a good job or a bad job. And there's a thing that happens when a bad blue screen or green screen goes through post. The artists will mutter under their breath about how badly it was done. And then, because usually the cinematographer is nowhere to be seen, they can do that with impunity. But if they know that I've shot the blue screenings, green screens, and now I'm supervising the comps, they get to complain directly to me.
So Dave, we started off talking about standard dynamic range. Obviously now we have high dynamic range. A number of productions are using that. What difference does that make to how you set up what you're looking for when it comes to shooting blue and green screens?
For me, it's given me a whole new task to analyze what makes a good blue screen or green screen in HDR. So this is what I did for standard dynamic range. I created myself a little cheat sheet, and this one is now a couple of years old because it was in the edition of my book from 2 years ago, which I'm currently in the process of updating. But what this gives you is a center line for illuminating a blue screen or a green screen, because I have found most success by exposing blue or green as if they were middle gray. Any brighter than that, you get a lot of spill. Any darker than that, you get a lot of noise in the mats. And exposing the middle gray for any given camera has meant that I had to figure out where that was on a scope for that particular camera. So using an ARRI Mini or Mini LF, or any of the older ARRI cameras, except for the ARRI 35, when working in log C, you can see that I have a table value of 38.33%, Canon logs 32%, all the way down to red log film 46%. So getting a correct exposure means getting a correct exposure for that particular camera for blue or green. I'm in the process of doing a new table for HDR, but because the EOTF curve is different for HDR, because PQ has a different middle gray reading, I'm going to have to redo the entire table as an exercise in middle gray for the PQ curve, perceptual quantization curve. And if you were using anything besides PQ, like hybrid log or one of the other HDR10 formats, they're going to have a different middle gray as well. So when exposing for any given log curve and any given camera, any given sensor, you're going to have a slightly different scope rating for all of those.
Green screen, blue screen, SDR, HDR. We've now got a new challenge, haven't we? With virtual productions using video arrays. And obviously this is now a completely different light source coming into the sensor on the camera.
Yes.
I know you've got experience of this, haven't you? It'd be fascinating to hear your thoughts on how you approach shooting with a video array.
Well, let me start off with fundamentals, because LED displays and LED walls in general are very narrow spectrum primaries. So I think let's go to the shots of the bell peppers first so that you can see. Usually when I work at my desk, I have two very big Rec 2020 PQ D65 monitors sitting astride my laptop on a stand. And those LED monitors are great to look at, but they're not a great illuminant for anything in the world. So if in this case, I did a little test just to show everybody what these monitors do and why I can't turn them on when I'm doing a Zoom call like this, because they're off right now. And you can see this is kind of what I look like under a normal camera, under tungsten light, with the monitors turned off. This is what I get when I turn my D65 monitors on and put up a D65 white field on these two LED monitors either side of my computer and light objects with LED narrow spectrum primaries. These are the same two peppers that you were looking at before under LED light. And the reason for that is while the primaries in the monitors are tuned for human eyes to make color that makes sense to our color perception, once you shine that light at a second surface and bounce it, it becomes something completely different. A phenomenon of narrow spectrum primaries. The reason that this happens is because LEDs make color out of narrow spectrum primaries in a way that fools your eye, but it doesn't fool the light that's falling on objects. So an LED system uses blue to make blue, and green to make green, and red to make red, but it doesn't produce real cyan light. It produces a combination of narrow spectrum blue and narrow spectrum green that trick your eye into seeing cyan. Similarly, it produces blue light and red light that tricks your eye into seeing magenta. And it produces green spectrum and red spectrum that tricks your eye into believing you're seeing yellow. So the waveform's set up in RGB, red, green, blue, and you can see Uh, when we put up a pure blue on the LED wall, we got a pretty decent blue exposure and a little tiny bit of green mixed in. So you can see that that's a pretty good vector shot. It's right on target towards blue. And that results in a pretty even looking blue screen across the field. Now let's go to blue screen overexposed. And that looks pretty hot. So let's go to the blue screen too hot RGB waveform view. And you can see that I'm well up at 100, over 100, maybe 109. I'm topped out in blue. And you can see that as we exposed brighter and got more blue, we also picked up a lot more green, which sort of lets, you know, that's sort of a clue about how LEDs make colors. Let's go to the too hot vector scope. So you can see a little width in the vector shot, and you can see that I'm right out at the edge of 100%, and I've sort of flatlined against the edge of the vector scope.
Yeah, you can see
in
the
terms of
clipping and you
exposure.
can see it being pulled towards green.
Right. Now let's go to green screen good exposure RGB waveform. And you can see that green has perked up nice to about 40% there at a nominal decent exposure. And it's picking up some blue in the exposure, which is interesting. Let's go to the vector shot of that. And it looks pretty good, but there's a little something odd there that's pulling towards blue a little bit. You can see in the pure spectrum of green. Yeah, it's a tiny little node. And I guess we should look at the green screen good exposure frame before we move on. So we put up some secondaries. We put up cyan, and it looks nice and cyan to the eye. And you can see that it's made up of green and blue. And you can see that it heads towards cyan, but it does this funny little pull, which is some blue contribution to get to cyan. And I'm still thinking this through, trying to analyze for myself what this means, but it's pretty interesting. And the same thing holds true for magenta, which this is 100% magenta, or 100% red and 100% blue to make 100% magenta.
Yeah, one of the unique things, Dave, that we found is when you're doing this on an LED wall, you're also lighting two diodes, and the wall gets brighter than it would be for red, green, or blue primaries.
Yes, and yellow, cyan, and magenta quickly get brighter than RGB, which becomes part of the control matrix that has to be built into the processors of the LED system. So there's quite a matrix working inside these display systems when they are showing you full color, or what you perceive as full color. And similarly for yellow, which I find to be very weird looking in an LED system. But the vector scope says, yeah, that's yellow. And the system makes it out of red and green. You can see just a little contribution in blue. So there's a heck of a matrix going on in there. I'm going to stop sharing that. So it's pretty obvious that narrow spectrum primaries to create color are difficult to control, and they're even more difficult for cameras to understand, because if the primaries in the LED wall are not coincident with the primaries, RGB primaries of the camera, it can play havoc.
Yes.
And it becomes very, very confusing to try and light the foreground subject standing in front of an LED wall with another LED, because what happens when you bounce that narrow spectrum primary light off of human flesh, what you get back is missing some colors. And the colors that are missing are holes in the spectrum, and no amount of color correction can put those colors back into skin if they're not there to begin with. I suppose we ought to look at some of the curves of some of the illuminants that so let's put up 6 various spectra plots. So these are the spectra of different illuminants that I have plotted. There's a daylight plot, there's an incandescent plot, there's a white LED plot, there's an RGB multi-emitter, a blended phosphor, and a fluorescent light. And the first thing that I have to say about all of these is that incandescent and daylight give you all of those colors to bounce off human flesh. And when those colors are there and they bounce off, they look right to a camera. But for example, and I'll draw the worst possible example, which is the fluorescent. There are holes in the spectrum at 525 and at 450 and at 650. There are big absences of color. And if there is no color at that frequency, then that never bounces off a human face, and you never see that color reflected from the human face, and it can look very odd. We did a study on this at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences called the Solid State Lighting Index study. Let's go to the illuminant spectra. These are shots that I managed to get from it's about a $9 little device that I get from Amazon.com called an ISCO spectroscope. And it is really just a diffraction grating in a black tube. And what it gives me is the ability to walk into any situation and instantly visualize what the deficiencies of the spectrum of an illuminant are. And I take one of these everywhere and I give them to my gaffer, because you can walk into an office building that's lit by who knows what, fluorescence, or xenons, or God only knows what kind of lights are in there, LED lights. And you can point the spectroscope at some of the illuminants, and you can see that these are not going to work. For example, this LED spectrum is not going to work for human faces. It's just not going to look good, and it's not going to color correct well. Similarly, the fluorescence in some of the office buildings that, this is literally from an office building that I scouted. And, this this is the kind of thing that you have to be able to identify in a matter of seconds while you're scouting a location. And if you have to change every bulb in the newsroom of the LA Times to get good exposure and good faces for a scene, you want to know that right away when you're scouting.
Yeah. The other thing, back to this shot, it really points out the phenomenon we always see when you're shooting outside and you walk and shoot inside and the scene goes very, very blue on you, is because of the amount of blue content in natural light that incandescence doesn't have, and it falls off. And because it's so high in the outside world, Mother Nature, it's really gonna roar blue until it's rebalanced again.
Yes, and the top daylight curve, just as an interesting note, I asked an astrophysicist about that daylight curve, and she told me if you took that daylight curve from the space shuttle, it would be different. So this daylight curve is concatenated with Earth's atmosphere as a filter.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes perfect sense. So
that's one of the reasons I'm going to be so interested to take one of the leader scopes and start doing some research. I'm working with a group at Baylor University in Texas, and we're creating a 6 primary display system. And one of the main reasons we're creating this display system is because NASA came to Baylor University, with whom they have a relationship, and they asked the question, when we go to space, it looks one way. When we shoot it on our cameras and bring it back to Earth and show it on these screens, it looks a whole other way.
Makes perfect sense when you think about the atmosphere and what the filtering's going on.
Yeah, but how do you quantify that? Because we're using RGB systems with, in the case of LEDs, narrow spectrum primaries, or laser projectors, narrow spectrum primaries, or cameras with wider spectrum primaries, but they're still RGB systems. And they still use a matrix of red and green to make cyan, and they all still use a matrix of, they combine colors to create the secondaries from holes in camera spectrum. Not as big a holes as we have in LED primaries, but there are still slopes and valleys. Yeah. So where shall we go next?
We're getting down on time. Did you want to bring up the white ball at all?
Yeah, that's part of my tool set as well. You're right, we are getting a little down on time. Let's just go through that quickly, because this is something that I invented way back in the early days of digital cinematography. This is something I came up with back when we were using first Sony f900s and 950s. And then the shot that I sent you that you corrected so nicely was from a Viper camera, which was a great camera in the right hands, but really hard to manage in terms of exposure and color, which dictated that I build something that I could quickly see how to expose for a human face. Yeah, that's it. This is a good example, because this was one of the log shots that we had, and the Viper would give you this gray-green picture that was impossible to understand and even harder to expose correctly. So what we quickly learned was to expose for the hottest channel and then dial everything else back up. But this is the one-eyed Jack. You can show one of the other grabs from the.
So there's a color corrected, same shot.
Right, and what that gives you is the ability to spot how hot your backlights are. This is a photopic white ball that is semi-gloss flat white with a hole in the side, and the entire interior is painted flat black, so that you quickly have the blackest black on set to compare to the hottest highlight off the back of the actor's head. And it is such a quick and easy way to set an exposure on a digital camera, but it only works when you use it with a scope.
Yes, and it can also be used here in looking at where you are in a PQ shot and
Exactly.
setting your white at 203 and then seeing what you've got in your speculars.
Yeah, and I think for HDR work, the white ball, one-eyed Jack, is making a comeback, because until we really wrap our heads around how to correctly expose HDR, we have to give ourselves metrics and displays like this. And I think this is a brilliant way to expose for HDR.
Yep.
If you've got to set a scene and then walk an expensive actor into it and have him start acting on the first take, you want to be spot on in your exposure. And if you're lighting a stand-in, that's one thing. But if you're lighting empty air and you got somebody to walk right in and start working, light this thing, it'll tell you exactly what your exposure needs to be.
So, Cindy, do we have a couple of questions? We can get to a couple of questions with the time that we have. We will answer all questions. We won't be able to answer all questions online, but we will go back and go through, and everybody's questions will be answered, and we will be getting to you folks. So you got one for us, Cindy?
Yeah, a couple of questions, and all the attendees have been great in answering each other's questions a little bit in the chat as well. So we've got
Sweet.
a lot
Nice.
of participation,
Nice.
which is
It's great.
fabulous. A question on lens spec sheets: do they typically indicate which type of lenses they are?
No, they do not. And in fact, there are LPL mount lenses and there are LPL mount lenses. And it is only by testing and only by probing more deeply that you can find out which lenses are more telecentric than others. Some lenses actually advertise it as a feature. I will say there are a few brands that advertise it as a feature, but not very many, because frankly, manufacturers don't expect that we, the users, are even going to know what that is and what it means.
All right, a question about the flat fields from the LED screens that you used. Wondering which camera and lenses were used.
Uh-oh, I promised I wouldn't tell
We
on
can
anybody.
circle back with people offline. It's totally fine.
Okay,
Another
all right.
question is, do the
I just want to make
numbers...
one quick comment, and I think Dave, you'll back me up on this, is that the wall we shot on was incredibly clean for an LED wall. It was one of the cleanest walls we've seen. So
And as
really
was the lens.
As was the lens, yes.
Lens in the camera were immaculate. And
Yes.
the reason that we did this exercise is to show that even with the best possible gear, you still get some of this, because the screenshot from the the black and white screenshots that I showed you of the gray field and the scope shots are more like the average thing that you'll get.
Okay, sorry, Sydney.
Oh, that was all good. Wondering on the table numbers you referred to earlier, do those refer to RAW or Rec 709?
Oh, that's all log.
Yeah. Well, there's some 709, there's log. So just look at the center of that. And it goes through the Sony logs, it goes through red log.
Yeah, and there's a
log.
709 output there, yes.
Yeah. So it's got both 709 through all of the camera logs in it.
Right. And if you trust the camera's 709 curve, then you can use that. I usually use log.
And I just want to say, you are a big proponent of having a waveform monitor on set to be able to actually look at and see what the heck you're really doing.
Well, one of the things you hear so often in imaging and shooting and in making films is people will walk up and look at an image and say, "What am I looking at?" And you can answer the question better if you have a waveform vector scope in front of you.
Yeah. Because sometimes it's a little bit of a guess at what's missing here. And
yeah, we're playing
2 seconds,
professional what's wrong with this picture.
Yeah. Yeah. In 2 seconds, you can see it and know what you need to correct for, rather than going, well, do I do it? Do I do it? Did it? And spend half hour farting around trying to fill a hole that's in the spectrum. And a waveform monitor will tell you instantly. So, and when you're talking about, screen time, shot time on the set, the waveform monitor is going to pay for itself in about a half hour or less.
Pretty much.
I think the rest of the questions we will come back to all of you, since we've really just hit our hour already.
Yes,
if that's okay with the three of you. So it was a wonderful roses are red, violets are blue. Do these colors look right to you? And thank you.
As we mentioned during our seminar, Dave has a book out about digital cinematography, and that's available for you to purchase via your normal retail outlets.